Hey, it's Craig Syracusa, and welcome to another episode of Walk in Faith, the show where we go beyond the image and we discover who our guests really are. You might know them from TV, the big screen, or even the world of sports, but do we really know who they are as a person? Do we know what motivates them? Do we know what inspires them? Well, that's what we're here to find out.
On today's episode of Walk in Faith, I'm going to sit down with Abby Spilka and discuss Calvary's first Grief Awareness Month. Stay tuned and walk with us. Abby, thank you for coming all this way. This is an important subject. I know it's a difficult subject, but I think a lot of people can relate to it. So before we get into it, in case our audience is not familiar with Calvary Hospital, can you tell me a little bit about the hospital, when it started, and can you compare it to, say, a traditional hospital?
Sure. So Calvary Hospital began in 1899. It's the nation's oldest and largest palliative care hospital. So we treat adults with life-limiting illnesses. So as opposed to a more traditional hospital, which is doing everything possible to cure. We understand that when people come to Calvary, probably most cures have been exhausted, and so the quality of life is what's most important. In addition, we treat the patient and the family in terms of their physical pain, their spiritual pain, and their emotional pain. So that's pretty different than what you might have encountered in your own hospital experience.
And how many locations does Calvary have?
So there are 4. We have the hospital in the Bronx, the mothership. We have a 25-bed unit in NYU Langone, formerly Lutheran Hospital in Sunset Park. We have the Dawn Green Hospice in Manhattan at Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home, and we have another nursing home presence in Queens.
So you mentioned, because you used the word hospice, is Calvary, is it a form of a hospice, and can you also just define or explain what hospice is?
Sure. So it is definitely a form of hospice, as well as the fact that Calvary does hospice care at home.
Okay.
So it's important for people to know that hospice is not a place, it's a philosophy of care. And because a lot of people don't know the difference between palliative care and hospice care, palliative care can also happen when people are still getting cures. It really is symptom management. And so you can have palliative care and treat, for instance, pain, a lot of pain management when someone is still getting cures. When someone is receiving hospice care, they're still getting palliative care to manage those symptoms, but it really is about making the patient as comfortable as possible and giving them as much of a quality of life as they can manage in whatever way they define it.
And now, would you say, like, the average patient, is it a certain age, and do the majority of them suffer from, is it mostly cancer, or do you treat or give them, the hospice care? Is it, like, what would you say, like, most people are suffering from?
I would say that most of our patients likely are dealing with cancer, but we also have a lot of people with congestive heart failure, any illness that is going to end one's life. We also have some people with end-of-life dementia. These are the things that cause our demise.
Is it mostly elderly, or is it?
We treat people from ages 20 and above, so we have a patient population across the spectrum.
And you briefly mentioned, like, some of the philosophy, but, like, who decided, like, where did the idea of Calvary come from, the idea, and what's sort of the philosophy behind it? I mean, do you have to be spiritual or Catholic or Christian to get care at Calvary?
Well, let me answer that question first. You do not. We have an amazing spiritual care department, and it is staffed by people of all faiths and backgrounds. Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Hindu, everyone's covered and everyone is welcome. And so if you are there and you are wanting spiritual care, we will find the person who is the right fit for you, which is wonderful. In terms of why we do this, the philosophy, there are core values of Calvary, which are care and respect and dignity and non-abandonment. And every staff member knows this. It's part of our employee handbook, because essentially it is treating the patient and their families the way we want to be treated. And so with bereavement, the work that I do, that is part of the philosophy of non-abandonment. So even though the patient has died, the family is living and needs some support while they're adjusting to this sort of new world order.
Would you consider Calvary to be a hospice or a traditional hospital?
No, Calvary is a fully accredited hospital, but we chose to focus on issues that happen at end of life, as I said, both medically, spiritually, and emotionally. That's our focus.
So from your experience, have you noticed or have you seen a change, or does faith play an important role when you're facing sort of the end of life? Or is it something you sort of shine away from some of the patients you've worked with?
Well, I will say this, that studies have shown that faith in whatever you have faith in is a protective factor. So that means that if other things are sort of working against you, having faith is something that truly helps you. Now, I will say when someone experiences the death of a loved one, whether it is sudden and tragic or a long illness, your assumptive world is shattered. What you know to be true has suddenly disappeared. So that means that your sense of safety and justice and that the world is a fair place kind of gets knocked around a bit. So I think that when people have a spiritual background and a faithful set of traditions, then it truly helps.
Have you noticed anything with prayer at all? I mean, because there are studies too that also show like prayer, if you pray, it sort of helps with comforting, it comforts the patient. Have you noticed that at all? Or do you pray with or anyone at Calvary pray with any of the patients?
I know that the spiritual care staff, the chaplains who go into the rooms, absolutely offer to pray with the patient. It's up to the individual patient, just as every illness is different and every grief experience is different, every faith experience is different too.
And how is this covered? Like, so if a patient decides to go to Calvary, is it a form of Medicare, or do they accept all sorts of insurances? How is it paid for?
Yes. And we also have really extremely generous donors.
Oh, that's great. And now you're part of, is it part of the Archdiocese, or is it part of
Yes, I know it's part of ArchCare, so part of the Archdiocese.
I want to get into more of your personal journey. You mostly focus on bereavement, right? Is that
Yes.
you're a bereavement counselor?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you deal with patients every day. Like, just how do you separate yourself from, dealing with these patients in terms of like when you go home? Are you able to shut this off, or is this something that sort of follows you all the way home?
Well, I will say this. It is different for me because I don't work so much with the families. I work with the people who have survived and are intending to live. And so I develop skills along with my staff members and colleagues where we just learn to hold space and bear witness. We bear witness to pain and to suffering. And for me personally, it's a spiritual calling. So I know at the end of the day that I have done my best, that I am holding space for dozens of clients. And so at the end of the day, I'm just, able to shut the door. Also, Calvary is really concerned about making sure that staff does not burn out. So they have a lot of things in place to make sure that we're not taking people home or the ideas home or the stress home.
I mean, it's got to be difficult. September it's Calvary's first Grief Awareness Month, so I want to talk about that. And also, because you mentioned, it's sort of your calling, and I'd like to know more about your personal story and your personal journey of faith. We'll be right back with Abby Spilka for the episode on Calvary. Welcome back, guys. So, Abby, we briefly mentioned your own personal journey, and September is Calvary's first Grief Awareness, focusing on bereavement support. So, now, a question I was thinking of, now, working at Calvary, I know this might be sort of a morbid question, but has it sort of helped you personally? Does it help you with your own mortality? Does it help you deal with death? Or what does it do for you personally?
Absolutely it does. I would say the first thing that it helps me with is it gives me so much perspective. Every day is a gift. You never know what day is going to be your last. You have to tell everybody you know that you love them, and you have to tell them all the time. I mean, it shifts your mindset. The stuff that used to really make me anxious or upset about, it just doesn't matter.
Like what small things? What examples can you give me?
Standing behind someone at a MetroCard stop, trying to put my MetroCard through, the person in front of me, please swipe again, please swipe again. I used to, like any New Yorker, get cranky, get mad. Now, it doesn't matter. There is no rush. We're all going to get onto that subway.
So people say, it's a sort of this transformation, like it's a mindset, like you have a different perspective and then your life changes. But, I mean, was this something that instantaneous you started working at Calvary where you were able to change your mindset, or was this something that you developed over a period of time?
Sure. So prior to working at Calvary, I was the assistant director at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. So I was working on a daily basis with survivors of trauma and loss. I loved the survivors. I loved my work there. It was a very important place to work. While I was working there, I was an eyewitness to the terror attacks of September 11th from my 25th floor office window, 5 blocks south of the towers. So between working at the museum and considering the 15 million people who died alone, and being an eyewitness to nearly 3,000 people being murdered, not being able to call their family members. I realized that I needed to make meaning from all of this loss that just surrounded me. And I became a hospice volunteer, which was so incredibly transformational for me. So as a hospice volunteer, I would work with patients and their families, but mostly with patients. And sort of like other sort of taboo topics that people don't necessarily talk about with their children or their siblings, they would talk about them with me, and death being the number one. So I was working with a patient who was 101. And at a certain point, she held my hand, and she ended up, I think, dying within a month. But she said, "I wish I could take you with me." Now, to most people, that might freak them out. But to a hospice volunteer who realizes that I'm working with this perfect stranger who feels so calm and so peaceful that they're not afraid to die is pretty powerful. And when I realized that I wanted that to be my job, I left the museum and I went to graduate school as a grown-up and taught at NYU for a couple of years after I graduated, and I was a clinician in a group practice, and I've been at Calvary for a year and a half where I run a number of different bereavement support groups.
Wow. That's a powerful story. But now, did you take something from your previous job? Were you able to use some things that you've learned through working at it's a Jewish Heritage Museum, was it?
Yeah, the Museum of Jewish
Was it
Heritage.
something that you took there that you were able to use when you started volunteering and encountering people like this 101-year-old?
Absolutely, because so many of the survivors who volunteered at the museum or just came to the museum or supported the museum had experienced such unbelievable death and trauma, whether they were small children or teenagers. And for me, many of them, including a wonderful man who just died in February at the age of 96, had so much faith in God and the world. And I couldn't understand how a man who survived 11 concentration camps could still be this man of faith, so loving and caring. I mean, he took me in as if I was his own daughter. That's just what he did, because he knew that we were going to continue his story. So I absolutely took a great deal from the individual survivors and from the themes of the museum.
Like stories like that, what does it do for your faith personally? Like to hear someone that survived all those concentration camps and still has a strong, connection to faith in God. Like, what does it do for you personally?
It keeps me extremely open-minded. I consider myself a very spiritual person, and yet I remember specifically after September 11th, I was sitting outside, and it was December, and there was a nest in a tree in Battery Park, and I just stared at that nest and said, "How on earth, given everything that was destroyed down here, is that nest still possible?" So those are the kinds of things I encounter, and I take meaning from them.
That's great. And now people handle death, differently, right? Everyone.
They sure do.
So how does someone know that they need bereavement, or why is bereavement helpful to everyone, or is it something that you need to do immediately after someone passes, or it's something you can sort of prolong and do later on in life?
Right. So it's interesting you ask, because for people who experience a loss, in the immediate aftermath, they're still kind of in shock. They're usually surrounded by family and friends. So that first month or two, they're trying to figure out a new routine. And then people might not be checking in as much, or people might have opinions about what they should be doing and saying, "You're not over it yet? It's been 6 months." So a lot of times when people come to our bereavement groups, it's because they need to talk about their story. They need to feel like they're not alone. So I would say in general that bereavement support is really education and reassurance and validation, because in American society, people really don't talk about death. I think people are afraid that if they talk about it, it will actually happen. So we talk about the grieving process. We talk about what to expect. We talk about different models of grieving. I always let people know that while loss is universal, grief is completely individual. And if I have 10 people in a bereavement group, they are all grieving differently, even though they've had the same experience.
That's what I was wondering, like if there was certain, like a process, like there's different levels, but you're saying everyone grieves differently.
And a lot of people are familiar with certain concepts about grief, but when they come to our bereavement support group, they understand that those 5 stages that everybody knows were really created in response to interviews with people who were dying. So these were their responses. But it just sort of became, well, this is how you grieve. But it's really important to know how, whatever you believe, it is not a linear process. It does not end. There is no such thing as closure. What we do is we integrate the grief into our life experience. I work with young adults who are between the ages of 18 and 32. And if you are in college when your person dies, They're not there for your graduation. They aren't there for your wedding if you choose to be married, if you choose to become a parent, and you will re-grieve their loss. You'll be triggered by all sorts of things. And so a lot of what we do in group is talk about what some of these triggers might be, even if you're not aware of them besides like the day the person died. Chances are you'll be feeling pretty bad. But if you smell their perfume somewhere, if you see someone walking down the street who looks like the person who died, you're just, going to go right back there. So we talk about how to cope with those things.
And how long is this whole process, or how long do they go to the support group? Is it a month or a week, or as long as they feel comfortable?
Sure. So our groups for death of a parent, death of a sibling, and death of a spouse partner, we work with the person up through 18 months after the death of their person. So if they come to us after 6 months, we'll work with them for another 12 months. For our death of a child group and young adult group, there is no similar time limit. And so we'll do an intake with someone. They'll be in the group for 6 weeks. We take a break so that we can bring other people into the group, and then we'll keep meeting on these 6-week cycles. Our children's groups, which also don't have time limits, are 8 weeks long.
So let's just take a quick break. I just have a few more questions.
Be right back with Abby.
Thank you, Abby. So just a few more questions, but you mentioned about, the children's support group is about 8 weeks. Do children grieve differently, say, from an adult?
They really do. They really do. Part of the fact is that they don't have the same vocabulary for grief. Also, as children develop, they understand grief differently. So a small child isn't going to understand if someone dies, what that means. But as they get older, usually between the ages of like 9 and 12, they understand that someone is dead. They're not coming back to life. They understand that dead means that all of their bodily systems have stopped, so they're not breathing, they're not eating, they're not walking. A lot of times we have to deal with children who, they pretty much understand that concept, but there's a lot of guilt, a lot of causality, because sometimes when you get really mad at your parent and you say, I hate you and I wish you would die, and then something happens, there's a lot of guilt to deal with. We spend a lot of time on causality, like you are not responsible for the death of your person by having a scary thought or a bad thought about them. And when we work with them in our bereavement groups, we do a number of things. We talk about the death, we talk about the funeral and the memorial service, and if they were sick and if they participated in it. I have a number of children in my tween group, my 10 to 12-year-old group, where we ask questions, and everyone gets to ask a question or gets to answer a question, and then anyone else who wants to respond can. So recently it was, before someone's death, I was scared of spiders, but after this person's death, I'm scared of dying. Those are pretty intense questions for 12-year-olds to be talking about, but they do it. We also talk about grieving and how to cope with grieving. So we talk about when you're grieving, you're not just sad, you're angry, you're confused, you're irritated, your grades might go down, you might really pick on your little brother. And so we talk about ways to deal with that. We do some breathing, we journal, we create art. We also talk about how to create rituals and memorialize the person who died. So in December, for instance, we created these lanterns made out of a mason jar and a little votive lamp, and decorated the lanterns and turned off all the lights. And so we said, this is, you're with your person. So it's sort of like an eternal candle. And then we also talk about ways that they can live their life to honor the person who died. So we don't use language like moving on, we talk about moving forward, and ways to use the things that you've learned from your person in the way that you choose to lead your life.
So now the kids that are in the support groups, were their parents, did they go through Calvary, or do you need to be?
No. So that's one of the wonderful things about Calvary, is that we work with the community. So it's rare, actually, that we have, in my groups anyway, that we have children whose families were part of Calvary. So we work with kids from the community who may have had someone die because of an accident, natural causes, a very short illness, and of course suicide, overdose, and homicide.
Just thinking about it that's got to be so difficult. Working with kids. Just in general, listening to their stories. You mentioned a few, but are there anyone that stands out, or just that holds sort of a special place in your heart? Like any of the kids that you've helped? Sure.
So we had one particular project where we wrote a play. We had puppets, and so the play that we created was, the puppets were zoo animals. So they were animals in a zoo, and the zookeeper died. And so everyone had to write a little paragraph on how their zoo animal character, what their relationship was with the zookeeper, and how his death affected them. And then everyone was going to deliver a eulogy. And they included that the zookeeper had given enough money so that the zoo would be open for free, and that it would be a bar-free zoo, so all the animals could just wander around and not be behind bars. We didn't talk about, and what if these animals eat those animals? Doesn't matter. And then we had the meal of consolation, the repast afterwards. And so I asked each one, what was this experience like for you? One person said he's always been afraid of public speaking, but this really helped him because we made a little podium where each animal was giving their eulogy. Another little boy said, I was 5 when my father died. Now I know what happens at a funeral.
Wow.
Okay, well, that really affected me greatly because we do a lot of education, but you don't necessarily think that you're going to affect the kids in this way. And then when each year we host our bereavement camp for children. So any child who participates in our bereavement groups can come for free to our week-long Camp Compass. And in those experiences, one of the things we do there is we have a memorial slideshow. So every counselor, every kid has provided a picture. And so we see who your person was. And just this past August, there was a moment where a little boy was crying and a little girl got a box of tissues and walked up to him to comfort him. And what I love about our groups, and I tell this to the adult groups and the children's groups, is that just being here and bearing witness to each other's pain increases our capacity for compassion and empathy. And the world just really needs way more people who are compassionate and empathetic. So if we can teach that to children who are, our groups start at the age of 6. If we can teach that to children starting at the age of 6, I'm hopeful that the world will be a better place.
Was that sort of the motivation behind this September First Grief Awareness?
I think the motivation really is that people don't talk about death. We don't talk about it with children. We don't talk about it within our own families. I know so many people who I've interviewed with their intakes. We didn't want to talk about the fact he was dying. We knew he was in hospice, but he didn't want to talk about it. These are the opportunities you have to really start talking about what you want, who your healthcare proxy will be, if you want to donate your organs, where you want to be buried if you want to be buried. And so opening up the conversation is really what Grief Awareness Month is about.
We spoke a lot about the children's groups, but can you tell me a little about the adult groups?
Sure. So the adult groups are really important, and there are a lot of people in the groups who probably didn't think they would find themselves in support groups. But we have death of a child, death of a spouse partner, young adult bereavement, death of a sibling, and death of a parent. And what I love about these groups is that there are people in these groups who might not encounter each other in any other situation, but they have this one thing that unites them. It's also really important for people to learn from each other different ways to grieve. One of the things we make sure that people understand is that grief is not just an emotional response and just one emotional response. If people are having trouble sleeping, if they're having a lot of headaches, if they're having some chronic stomach aches, we explain that these are manifestations of grief. If you can't find your car keys, if you are sure that you went to the grocery store and yet you didn't get wheat thins, there are reasons that this is happening. So we talk about all of the ways that grief affects us, and we talk about ways to cope. We do some meditation, we do some breathing, we do a lot of expressive arts activities, because for a lot of people, they aren't comfortable talking about what they're feeling. But if you give them some sort of prompt, they are willing to draw about it, they're willing to write about it, and we don't insist that people share when we do this, but we want to give them an outlet. Because as I'm fond of saying, there are 168 hours in a week, and if you can devote these 90 minutes to just taking care of yourself and giving space to what you're feeling, you'll be so much better.
And how many people are in the groups usually, for the adult groups?
In the adult groups, it ranges. I would say usually 10 to 14. Sometimes there are a few more, sometimes there are a few less. And then, as I said, for many of our groups, there's the 18-month timeline, and then those people will graduate out, and that way we can bring new people in. And in Brooklyn, I've started 2 different groups for people who are grieving 2 years and beyond, one for death of a parent and one for a death of a spouse partner. So if people, those groups will meet monthly, so if people really just want to check in, and I imagine a lot of people will want to check in around the holidays. The rest of our groups are closed, so that means you have to wait until the end of the cycle, but these groups are a little more flexible because we want to meet the needs of our community.
And what would you say to someone that's watching this that's sort of hesitant, saying, I'm handling it my own way, whether it's, going to the gym or whatever they feel like is they're able to do to cope with the death of a loved one? What would you say to someone that's watching this and still sort of on the fence?
I would say if you have a really strong support system, if you have really positive coping mechanisms, if you have people in your life who will just sit with you and be with you, then I think you're probably doing really well. If you feel like you're not coping so well, if you're eating more, if you're drinking more, if you're shopping more, if you do not have people in your life who can really support you, if they're the people saying, why aren't you over this by now? Then you should call us and come and be with people who understand where you are and will support you.
So just one last thing, because it seems like if, speaking about death, being open about death, also if you don't talk about death, it seems like it would put a strain on the family itself because now you're gone, you moved on. But then there's also, this is what dad would want, this is what mom would want, and nobody really knows.
Yeah.
So, is it beneficial for your family also to be involved in this conversation, or what are the benefits that you do have sort of a plan for your life?
Absolutely. Because I can tell you from personal experience and from professional experience that after your person has died, your brain is just, it's not your brain. It's as if it's been taken out and put someplace else. So making real important decisions is not something that comes so naturally when you're in shock. So whatever conversations you can have now, one of the things that we did with Grief Awareness Month is we created an entire reading list, including age-appropriate books for children, to be able to talk about death. And I really recommend that you don't wait until a death happens. There are a number of sites where you can download forms to say, this is where all my documents are. This is what I want to have happen at the funeral. I hate daisies and I only want chrysanthemums. Even if it seems small, you get the autonomy and the choice to say, this is how, after my death, if I can't have so much choice in how I die, this is what I want to have happen afterwards. And it really does take the burden off the families.
Now, is there a website or a way more people can find out about Calvary and the Bereavement Month?
Absolutely. CalvaryHospital.org. We have, I know /bereavement is where all of our bereavement services and our support groups are. And I know that there are other materials there that will be extremely beneficial to everybody.
Well, thank you so much. I
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate this conversation.
Sure.
Definitely a difficult one for both of us and for our viewers. I hope you learned a lot on today's episode. Always remember, you have the ability to inspire and evangelize through your words and actions.